Right, we're going to look at this time is we're going to look at actually how to create selections in Maya. So first things first, anytime we want to create a selection, so we have our main things which are vertices, edges and faces. All we need to do is just right click, and here we have access to faces, to the individual face of the object. We have edges and we have vert as well. Okay. We also have a couple of other things in here. We have a vertex face, which is worth just showing you because if you accidentally click on that, you may think you've broke your model. You haven't. Just go back and choose another sub-object. We have UVs, which at the minute we just don't need to worry about. We're really looking at the modeling side of this currently. We have multi, which actually allows you to get access to all of the sub-object components, which can be useful and depends what you're doing. Sometimes it's nice just to work on, say, vertices themselves, so you're not accidentally selecting edges or faces, but you do have that capability as well. And then finally in here we have this object mode. So object mode allows us to get back out of the subcomponents, back up to the root level, so we can just manipulate our object there as well. Okay. Also got a keyboard shortcut, F8. What F8 does is go between. So we have here component selections now on. So it will go back to whichever component you last had on. So mine was multi, so it goes back to that. Press F8 again. That goes back to our object selection. And now we're back in object mode. We can also use the modeling toolkit as well. So under the modeling toolkit, we can just always forget where this is. Here we are. So under mesh tools, if you don't have this open, you might have this show modeling toolkit. So here I've got hide modeling toolkit, show modeling toolkit if that's not there. And it may appear down the side, or similarly it may appear across the top, but it's within the same area as the channel box and the attribute editor. So with our modeling toolkit, we have similar things. We have our object mode, we have verts, edges, faces, and UVs. And we also have this multi-component as well, which you see just highlights those three sub-objects there. Okay. So when it comes to actually selecting these subcomponents, there's a couple of different techniques. So I can drag select around this. I'm still on my move tool here. So I can drag select around any of these vertices within this. Okay. You have to be careful. I can drag select around multiple ones to select them. We do have to be careful about this in case we have this at a different angle. If I drag select around, then what we may accidentally do is select verts at the back, or even different subcomponents at the back as well, accidentally. I would always advise that you just look around your model anyway to get a sense of what you have selected. If I want to deselect, I can just click off anywhere in a space, our empty space. Okay. I can go in and I can just click on individual verts as well to select them. And then what we can do is we can add multiple selections. So if I go in and select one, I can add to that selection by holding down Shift. So if I hold down Shift, we get a little plus icon on here, and then I can add to that selection. Okay. If I want to take away from that selection, I can use Control key. So if I press and hold down Control, we get a little minus, and then I can take away. And I can either do that or drag select as well around these things. Okay. Now it's worth noting that Shift, which is to add to a selection, will also take away from existing selections. So if I go over this with Shift pressed down, so this is already selected. If I go over it with Shift pressed down, this is just worth noting actually as well. If I go over this, we sometimes get this extrude up, and this is particularly the case if you're working over more of a dense mesh. You might accidentally extrude out. I'm not going to talk about the extrude tool here, but if this happens and you're just trying to select something, then what we can do is just move to these, just so the selection tool Q, or we can grab the icon from over here. And now when I shift click over that, you see we're just getting the minus. I can deselect that. So Shift will add to something that's not already selected. If we go back over that, it will take away from that selection. Okay. If we just want to add to this without accidentally, so if we're dragging around these, and then I'm dragging around to maybe get something at the back, if I drag around too much, then I will select something that isn't selected but deselect the existing selection. So that can be problematic. So what we can use is a keyboard shortcut, Control and Shift. So if I press Control and Shift down, this is just going to add to the selection no matter what. So even if I redrag over something that's already selected, it won't deselect it. Okay. Let's go back into my object mode. Let's just click on a different example now. So what I'm going to do is go into Edge Selection. So Edge Selection, exactly the same thing. I can click on edges or drag select around edges. I can add to a selection by holding down Shift, or I can hold down Control and Shift so that I don't accidentally deselect. I can deselect from a selection by pressing down Control, or I can shift click over an existing selection to get rid of those. Okay. What we can also do with this is we can select edge loops really quickly. So these are all examples of edge loops around the sphere, and also down here these are rings of edges as well. So if we want to select a whole strip or a whole ring of edges, I can just simply double click and that will select the entire loop. I'll just press F here to focus in. Okay. If I wanted to add another selection, I can just Shift to bring up the add to selection, double click, and we can carry on doing that as much as we want to. Okay, so that's just a different thing with edges. Let's go into faces. Exactly the same procedure. I can click on something or drag select around something. I can add to a selection with Shift or with Control and Shift. And I can take away from the selection by clicking Shift on something already existing, or pressing and holding Control down to take away from a selection. I can also select rings of faces as well. So if I click on all loops of faces, so if I click on a face here and then just Shift double click on its neighbor, that will select all around these joined faces. Similarly, if I was to click here and Shift double click, it will select all the ones within there as well. And we could do similar things to what I was doing the edge. I can click on that and then I can press Shift to add to this. Click on this and then Shift double click on its neighbor and that will select that. Okay. The important thing is here you click on a neighboring face. I can't just click here and then click over here. That will just select in between, which can be quite useful. So if I want to just select from there to there, I can do that, and that's going to select in between those, and the same with edges and verts within that as well. But if we want to select the whole loop, then I have to Shift double click on the neighbor. Okay. The final thing with just making these selections is the Tab key. So if I press and hold down the Tab key, again we get a different little icon. And this is essentially a paint technique. So now what I can do is just paint over to select whichever faces I want on there. And the great thing about this is it ignores the back faces on this. So we won't accidentally select anything that we're not painting on. And that also works with edges and vertices as well. Okay. So they're just different ways to create selections. So we've got our Shift to add, Shift to take away from existing selections, Control to take away, Control plus Shift just to add and never to take away, and then we have Tab to use our paint tools. Just a point about the Shift key, by the way. If I click on this one, can be quite useful. So I mean, it's not as obvious with this, but I use this with cylinders quite a lot if I want to get rid of the top and bottom. So say for example, I want this set of faces around here. I could just select these two, which are easy to select, and then Shift drag around that, and what it will do is actually do an inverse selection, because we're deselecting the things we already had selected and selecting everything else as well. Okay. As a side note, we have a select up here. We do have a select inverse, select all by type, which is a different way of selecting things more on the viewport itself. So I have some different ways of selecting things as well within here. Okay. Go back into object mode, and that's just a quick look at selections.